All right, peeps. This week I have my boy genius Ryan Nakade on the pod to share how he discovered the work of Michael Brooks through the integral movement and some of his own political theorizing behind the scenes to his podcast entitled MetaIdeological Politics with his good friend Nate Kaufman. Some of the many topics that we touch upon are postmodern conservatism as found in the work of Matt McManus, the future of religion and politics in North America, the growing gender polarization at the heart of the culture wars, and various new online digital communities and alternative media ecosystems. Like always, I hope you enjoy the conversation and make sure to check out the show notes. Sweet. All right, bud. Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I mean, obviously the conversation with Jeremy and Matt and with Ben Burgess, I mean, it's been really helpful for me to go out and reflect back on my own sort of integral journey and how I came to go out and discover Michael Brooks' work. So I want to circle back to you because we've been having a lot of conversations back and forth on Discord and across various different mediums. And so I just want to go out and open it up and just kind of get you to I guess, re-narrate, I guess, your story in terms of how you came to Michael Brooks the first time around in terms of his work and I guess its relationship to integral theory as well. So let's just go and start there. I mean, when did Michael first come on your radar?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Eric. It's great to be here, and I love talking to you on Discord and online, and so it's always a lot of fun and brings me a lot of joy. So it's nice to have a live conversation, and I'm a big fan of yours and all of the guests that you've had on. So I'm really happy to be here. You know, it's interesting with Michael because I became aware of him maybe in like 2017, 2018, just because I was following a lot of online leftists and leftist YouTubers. And so naturally he popped up from the YouTube algorithm. And the first time I saw him, he was doing a lot of attacking of the IDW guys, particularly Dave Rubin. He kind of became famous for dunking on Dave Rubin and in a very humorous, acerbic way. So I thought that was kind of entertaining, but didn't think much more of his overall work and, you know, everything that he was saying. I had no idea that he was associated with integral theory or spirituality or Buddhism or any of these interesting things that we're into in any way, right? I just thought he was just another kind of standard leftist political commentator on YouTube. And then in 2019, I met Jeremy Johnson and we became buddies and started talking. And Jeremy, I was looking at Jeremy's Mutations podcast and was like, no, he interviewed Michael Brooks. It was like my mind was blown, like two worlds colliding, you know. It was like the integral spiritual Gebser, you know, liminal whatever scene kind of colliding with the mainstream leftist online YouTube scene. I was like, just like my mind was blown. Yeah. And so I asked Jeremy,
just like
I was
me.
like,
I mean, that's very similar to my story as well.
yeah, totally. Yeah. And I listened to it. It's like, oh my God, Michael Brooks, like the socialist, you know, Bernie supporter. This guy's into like Gebser and consciousness and Buddhism. Like what the, I couldn't believe it. So after figuring that out, I then perceived Michael and his work in an entirely new light. I then started watching everything that he talked about, obviously. Right. And you know, before he passed away, a lot of his content was becoming more explicitly integral, and he was mentioning like, check out Jeremy Johnson and Brent Cooper and Michelle Bowens, and you know, that was really cool, and I was really looking forward to his show going more in that direction. And of course, very tragically, he just passed away at a young age, very suddenly, and very abruptly. So yeah, that's kind of my background with Michael.
Cool, because that's really similar to me as well. I mean, well, because I was just shell-shocked, you know, once I saw Jeremy on his show talking about Gebser. So I had no idea that there was this connection, you know, I mean, because Michael really is, I mean, you know, far out on the left, and he's very active in terms of the whole socialist theme and, you know, in some big outlets as well. I mean, his connection to Jacobin, the Majority Report, and that's not a media ecosystem that I was just not paying attention to it just as much. I mean, as some other people. I mean, that has to go and do as well, I guess, because I'm up in Montreal, and obviously, in terms of, I can't go out and follow everything that's going on in terms of the States, in terms of news there and stuff like that. But once I saw Jeremy on there, and I saw that the Gepser connection and how he was informed, integrally informed in terms of how he was going out and unpacking the whole kind of his whole discourse around the left and what he was framing sort of as what I'm starting to go out and call as a next left. I was floored. So that's when I reached out to Jeremy. And then obviously I got pulled into your whole world in terms of the Discord and some of the more sort of online integral movement, which I was not following that closely since the kind of the Integral Naked days, and when Integral Naked kind of became Integral Life. I got really turned off at that point, and I just kind of tuned out or stopped following a lot of the stuff that was going on online. So when I got pulled into Jeremy's Discord, and obviously the other Integral Discord as well, that you guys were kind of using as a as a sounding board for yourselves, and obviously how you guys are involved online through Facebook. I was just like, oh my God, there is this whole other online world that I just haven't been following very closely. So you and Jeremy, I mean, I have so much to go and thank you for going out and exposing to me like a whole other kind of subculture that's been ongoing since Integral Naked became Integral Life. So I guess that's the other question too that I have for you is that, like how far, or because, with Jeremy, is kind of goes far back within the integral movement as well. So when did Wilbur and the whole integral movement kind of really come on for you, and it started to have a big impact for you personally?
Yeah, I was 17 years old and living in Hawaii. I grew up on the Big Island, and I was a high school dropout. So I homeschooled, even though I wasn't really doing any schooling. And my mom is a Buddhist minister. She's a Zen minister. And so, do you know the Sounds True?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So she was a big fan of Sounds True and would order a bunch of like books and audio tapes and stuff from them. And she got one on Wilbur randomly because it looked interesting. I think it was, what was it called? Brief History of Everything, the audiobook.
Okay, cool.
And we put it on in the car when I was 15 years old and driving around, and we were like, what the hell is this guy talking about like holons and quadrants and like cosmic evolution. Like we just like tuned it out. But then when I was 17 and I was kind of going through my own spiritual awakening / spiritual crisis, I somehow remembered him and felt like there was something there, and started reading his earlier works like Atman Project and Up from Eden and No Boundary and so forth. And it was really helpful for me psychologically and spiritually to kind of get my path established and understand these very important distinctions he was making, that probably earned him the label of like the Einstein of consciousness, And so I wasn't into politics or social theory back then. I just was trying to navigate some mental health and spiritual crisis issues. And his work was instrumental in helping me to get to heal and evolve and get beyond those problems. Then I kind of went to like a spiritual college and really engage in like Eastern philosophy and spirituality and yoga and meditation, and kind of put the Wilbur and integral stuff on the side. And I ended up coming back to it. It was always kind of in the back of my mind, but I ended up coming back to it in about 2014, 2015. I first found Wilbur out, I should say, when in like 2009. So 2014, 2015, it started coming back on my radar. And then in 2016, when Trump won, I read his Trump in the Post-Truth World, and then really got back into integral theory from 2016 to like 2019.
Gotcha.
And that's when I met Jeremy, and then you, and then the rest is history.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, because I wasn't too sure in terms of your own evolution through that as well. I mean, Wilbur is pretty much the same thing for me. I mean, Wilbur came online when I was 16, 17 through family as well. I mean, through my dad. And the first book that I actually read of his as well was A Brief History of Everything. And I mean, it just blew me open, as somebody that was just starting to go out and, get a little more interested, obviously, in current events and obviously the whole stuff around philosophy. I mean, he just opened up the whole world of philosophy and psychology to me in a whole new way that I mean, without him, I mean, I don't know where I would be today. I mean, because school, when I was in high school, it wasn't like, obviously I did okay in school. I was involved in sports and extracurricular and took that activities, but school was never really I was more of a jock
Of
than
course you were.
a sort of intellectual. So, I mean, but coming across his work, I mean, he just opened me up intellectually. Right. And I mean, it was great because I had I was able to go and talk to my dad about that. I mean, my dad's background is actually in counseling psychology and physical education. So even when he came across Wilbur's work, I mean, it really opened up even for him, his own personal world for his ongoing kind of personal education and development and stuff like that. So that's, it's been an ongoing sort of personal journey, even within my family and kind of like you as well. I mean, like another big aspect of Wilbur's work was the existential spiritual dimension to that. And, like I lost my brother, to leukemia at a very young age. And it was a big sort of formative experience for me growing up and obviously for, the impact on our whole family. And Wilbur was there in a certain way to go out and for us to go out and existentially and spiritually sort of unpack that obviously event of losing my brother, but also to go out and make sense of our horrible relationship to religion. Growing up in Quebec, I mean, we're, like the whole kind of Catholic environment. So he opened us up to obviously Eastern spirituality, Buddhism. So that whole avenue and how it fit into to psychology. So, I mean, and that's pretty interesting thing too, because there's a lot of people out there that discovered Wilbur in their late teens, early 20s, and it's been a real formative sort of teacher for them moving into their to young adulthood and eventually to adulthood. And that's the cool thing about Michael as well, right? Which talking to Jeremy and even talking to Ben and obviously talking to Matt, that's a dimension to Michael's kind of personal journey that they're not that aware of. They, like he really came online for them much more, I guess, we're on the political the political stuff. So I guess that's kind of the other thing too, because even when I was talking to Jeremy is that, like Wilbur had a big formative experience on us personally growing up, but politically as well, like our own political journeys in terms of discovering, I guess, where we would fit on the political spectrum is an interesting one as well. So for you, I guess, when did you kind of come online politically, in terms of your relationship to integral theory and to political theory and your interest in political science more broadly?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'd be curious in your answer in this too, right? So, little personal story. I actually was totally apolitical for much of my like in like my teens and early 20s. I was only into spirituality and consciousness, or what Wilbur would call like the upper left quadrant. And I remember this is how bad it was, Eric. I remember I came back from California and Oregon, went back to Hawaii, and I was voting in some kind of like local election. And I asked my dad at the age of 22 years old, Dad, what is the difference between a Democrat and a Republican, and which one should I vote for? Right. This is 22 years old. Right. So I was way, way behind. I didn't know what the difference was between a liberal and a conservative or any of these things. So I started reading a lot of books. And naturally, in 2014, the most recent presidential election was the 2012 election between Obama and Romney. So I went back and watched all of the Republican debates leading up to Romney becoming the Republican nominee, right? So it was like Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum and Ron Paul and Romney. And I actually became a big Ron Paul libertarian guy for a while. Okay. And it was really funny because I went to Estonia and was working on alternative school, and some of the reporters interviewed me for a magazine, and they were asking me about politics and education, giving like the American perspective. And I'm so embarrassed looking back. Every single one of my answers was just a straight up libertarian, borderline anarcho-capitalist answer of like, we'll just get the government out of everything and privatize and deregulate, put market mechanisms to work, enable competitive dynamics, and everything will just work out fine. And like that was like literally my kind of a scripted kind of answer for any political issue. And then in 2015, I got another job in Hawaii, and all of my coworkers were huge fans of Bernie Sanders. And basically, I did a 180 and went from being a Ron Paul libertarian to being a huge Bernie Sanders fanatic, and totally
turned into a Bernie bro like overnight.
Total Bernie bro overnight, total progressive, started reading all the progressive leftist books, anti-capitalist critique, and advocating for things like universal healthcare and that kind of stuff. So that was kind of what I was going through at the time.
But that was before Peterson came online, though, if I understand correctly.
It was.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So you'd become a Bernie bro at that point, even before coming across Michael's work and stuff like that.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I was always trying to commensurate that real, strong progressive political instinct with integral theory, and kind of wondering, like, what stage is this? What quadrant is this? Right? Like, how does this reflect what I'm going through internally and developmentally, with my changing political leanings and so forth, right? And I kind of had a dual, like a real love of integral, and also like a real dissatisfaction with integral in regards to politics, right? So the thing that I really appreciate, I will be eternally grateful to Wilber and integral theory for really kind of infusing into me this attitude of like multi-perspectivity and multi-dimensionality, and taking all of the whole political spectrum into consideration, and really considering all of the stakeholders, all of the values, all of the needs, all of the arguments. And everyone has a piece of the truth, right? It's important to take all these perspectives, even contradicting perspectives, into consideration to try to grok the whole picture in the most holistic and comprehensive way possible, right? So that was something that, the spirit of that, I'm really grateful that Wilber kind of taught me that, right? The thing that I don't like about integral, and I'd be curious about your take on this too, Eric, right? In terms of like the Wilber and the kind of mainstream integral life institutions of integral, like their politics didn't seem very coherent, right? There was a lot of like what I'd call color reductionism, or trying to explain complex political phenomena only through like a spiral dynamics lens. I didn't really feel like there was enough lower right quadrant structural and systemic literacy that was brought into the analysis. That's something that Michael really provided, right? Really emphasizing material analysis, Marxism, cosmopolitan socialism, and so forth, right? He wasn't just reducing everything to developmental stages or colors. And so I felt very dissatisfied with the analysis and political sense making from, like Jeff Salzman and all of these kind of integral life figures, and luminaries in that community. So I don't know. It was kind of like I appreciate the spirit of integral and really grokking diverse perspectives to overcome political polarization and move society towards a more integrative and holistic state. But at the same time, I was very dissatisfied with the narrative leadership of the mainstream integral community, and was looking for alternatives. And that's where I met Jeremy and you, and kind of developing, our voice in this whole ecosystem.
No, definitely. Well, I mean, even for me, I mean, like, because Jeremy seems obviously around Occupy, he got pulled in way more to the left than I would ever go and consider myself to be.
Right.
I never considered myself a leftist or even a socialist, personally, at any point growing up. I've always, like in Quebec, because, I grew up in a very liberal Trudeau family sort of orientation politically. And I guess the liberal worldview in Quebec, and in particularly French-speaking side of Canada, is much more, I guess, democratically, well, they're social democrats in a certain way. And I mean, this is the funny thing about the Trudeau family, whether it be Justin Trudeau or Pierre Trudeau. I mean, they're very difficult to go and pin down politically in terms of where they fit on the political spectrum. And for myself, I mean, I've just naturally kind of grew into that. In terms of, my family growing up, that was just the political worldview that we held. And so growing in, even to, I guess, discovering Wilber's work and getting much more interested in humanistic and transpersonal psychology, and it just fits naturally, I guess, within that sort of progressive worldview, right? I mean, it's not necessarily against liberalism, but it's not really hardcore neoliberalism in a certain way. It's strange. I mean, integral theory, when I think about its kind of trajectory in terms of as a social movement, even politically, I mean, it's very difficult to go and pin it down. But I got very turned off right around that time when the Integral Institute and Integral Naked became Integral Life. And they started to adopt that whole sort of conscious capitalism sort of worldview. And the reason
Right.
why I got turned off that is just because I was in the corporate world. You know, I was working for Dell
Mm.
Computer Corporation. I was working for a whole slew of other corporations in Canada, mostly all within the IT environment and the IT industry and telecommunication industry. And I was just seeing how it was deadly. I mean, there was no way in hell, you know, unless you were just there to go out and make money, but to actually go out and grow and develop as a person, or to go out and set down some roots, to go out and either, you know, for me personally, to go out and have a family, or just to go out and have some sort of livelihood and find some sort of, you know, work life balance, it was impossible. So, you know, and there were people, I guess, within that particular environment that were moving progressive ideas in terms of, you know, like democracy in the workplace. Let's go out and develop sort of more progressive thinking in terms of how we can go out and adopt technology or use technology to go out and make the workplace more balanced, right? I mean, within human relations, or even in terms of human resources, I mean, there are progressive wings to it, but I mean, it's so difficult for it not to go and get co-opted by the more sort of neoliberal, you know, capitalist dimension to it. And I was, you know, kind of having gone out and interfaced a bit, I guess, in terms of within that corporate world and where it met, I guess, the labor movement in Quebec, where I saw so much corruption. There was just I mean, Quebec is one of the most unionized sort of environments politically, particularly within the public sector, but even within other industries as well. I mean, Quebec is by far the most unionized province in all of Canada, I would go and say. So there is that very strong, tight-knit community on that side that's gone way much more to the left in a certain way compared to all the other provinces in Canada. But that was an environment that I just never felt that comfortable in. So when that was all going on, and obviously, I mean, the 2008 financial crash, and then obviously Occupy, when I was, you know, looking at the Integral movement, trying to go make sense of it, there was just nothing in there. So very much like Jeremy, I was just like, what the hell is going on? Like nothing is going on. And if I would have discovered Michael at that point, I mean, I think that would have been, you know, so helpful for me to go and make sense of that whole period from 2008 all the way up to the, you know, currently from a political dimension. So very much kind of like you. I mean, I think this is why I've enjoyed interacting with you online and some of the stuff through the Discord, is that it's really helped me to go and make sense of, you know, like the whole political spectrum, right? And where do I fit into that? And where do my own personal values actually fall politically, right? And this is, I guess, the interesting thing, you know, that I want to go and pick your brains about, is that because through your own podcast now, is that you're somewhat agnostic in terms of where you fall on the political spectrum. You seem to be much more willing to go out and move from the right and to the left, and to go out and try and navigate to see what's most skillful in the immediate moment. So I guess that's kind of like, I want to go out and pick your brains now, is that, do you feel like, where do you personally feel your political allegiance, I guess, you know, where do you feel you fall on the political spectrum? And do you feel that you even have a political tribe at this point right now, where you are, you know, kind of in your own life right now, and even just kind of looking at the political landscape out there?
Yeah, this is an excellent, really excellent question. So my answer to this is this: if the average American asked me, Ryan, where do you fall on the political spectrum? It would be intellectually dishonest for me to give any other answer than I'm on the left in terms of policy positions that I hold, right?
Yeah.
Like if I were to say, oh, I'm a, you know, meta integrative Chad centric, whatever, like, okay, but like I basically, like, I would be seen as a liar. Like, well, do you support this? Do you support that? Do you support universal healthcare? Do you support UBI? Do you support stronger unions? Do you support climate action? Do you support blah, blah, blah? I would just say yes to like almost all of those things, at least in some way. And so for me to say that I'm somehow like, beyond it or above it or not on the spectrum, I think would kind of on an interpersonal level be seen as being dishonest or not being like really transparent about my actual political and ideological leanings. I think in terms of how I subjectively identify, I don't identify really as being on the left. I feel like a lot of conservative, right-leaning perspectives or insights I also embrace. But I think the difference with conservatives these days is that I don't embrace them exclusively, right? I don't embrace those ideas at the exclusion of left ideas. I try to hold both of them, maybe in different ways and in different contexts and to different degrees and emphasis. But I'm not excluding any ideologies or perspectives or ideas, and I try to kind of weave them together, and then through that talk to people on their own terms, using their own ideological frameworks that they're comfortable with and the language that they're used to talking with, right? And that's a way for me to practice depolarization and to build bridges and to engage with people of diverse political and ideological backgrounds. So in that sense, I can see how it, like optically or aesthetically, I kind of look like I'm agnostic, or I might not really have a tribe, so to speak. And I don't feel like I do. I feel like I get a little bit of something out of every group, but I don't feel like a overwhelming sense of identification with one group. I kind of distribute my group identifications all over, right? Like, you and I talk about like, there are traditional conservative Christian groups I like talking to and interacting with and really getting into theology and virtue ethics and religious questions in ways I can't with friends who are really into social justice activism and DEI and so forth, right? And all of my needs and interests are never met by one group or tribe, so I have to have a lot, and I get a little bit of something from all of them, but never all of them in one of them.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, and that was kind of the funny thing for me. I mean, Jeremy, obviously, I mean, because of his background in integral theory, the conversations I've had with him, and even I guess some people through the Discord, is that it's much more fluid in terms of an understanding to be able to go and swim across the whole political spectrum, right? From the far right all the way up to, the far left, and try and go out and make sense of it. And through integral theory, I mean, obviously we can go out and talk about it developmentally in a certain way, whether I agree with that or not. But that's why, I mean, on the disc, I've been even laughing because, like, at times I felt bad for Jeremy because, I mean, obviously he's much more progressive and much more to the left, than I am. And at times I'm feeling like, well, like I need to go out and post this stuff from, the postmodern right, or the stuff around McManus's work, or even some stuff around, the Catholic integralists, since I have a personal interest in that. But at times, like I feel stuck as well, right? That people don't want to go out and talk about the full political spectrum. Like when I was talking to Ben Burgess and even to Matt, like, I mean, I felt myself kind of like at times going out and being like, well, like, I don't think I could openly go out and press them in a certain way, or I can in a way to think that, like, and I did with Matt in a certain way, to think that, the new right or the postmodern conservatives, the way he's framing it, might be an appropriate sort of developmental, or even having a historical moment that might be beneficial for us moving forward. And at times when I was talking to Ben, or even when I talked to Matt, at times like they view it like 100% negatively. And I have a tough time wrapping my head around that, seeing that, there can't be any good coming out of it. Like, I don't, think Jordan Peterson's arguments, theologically or psychologically are that particularly sophisticated. And politically either, right? But obviously he's hit a chord for people to go out and unpack some stuff.
Absolutely.
So to me, like, that's an interesting question. I've always, like, when I've interacted with you, I've always felt like we've been able to go out and wrestle with the full political spectrum and start to go out and really wrestle, like, one, is it, is this some sort of character trait that people have? Or is it some sort of thing that people can go out and inhabit for a certain time, right? And use that developmentally as some sort of capacity that people can go out and inhabit to go out and achieve some sort of, skillful or upaya, skillful means in the world, right? So I guess this is my question to you, I guess, in terms of your podcast that you're doing right now. Do you view the sort of meta-ideological sort of framework that you're developing as a map that people can use, or is it really to go out and just go out and, I guess, is it just really just a map that people can go out and reference, or is it something that people can go out and enact all across the political spectrum? Like, how are you making sense of that currently right now in terms of your own political understanding of, the full political spectrum that you're talking about here?
Oh yeah, this is great. There's so much to say about this. But one thing I'll mention, just to tie back into Michael, was I think this is something that Michael really did a beautiful job advocating for, even if in my view he didn't always like live it. Like he was very much for this, practically and philosophically, of really understanding, like let's say Jordan Peterson as an example, right? Like why there's so much demand for his product, right? We may disagree with the content, but we need to have, especially, he was advocating for the left to really understand what's really driving the right, and what kind of insights, what kind of talking points is the right hitting on that is able to attract so many people, especially particular demographic groups, right? Like the kind of stereotype Peterson fan of like the young kind of incel-esque white male who feels alienated, right? And wants some sense of meaning and re-enchantment and personal empowerment. And how can some of these ideas be integrated into leftist politics for truly holistic politics, where we can subsume voters or people who are against progressive ideas by speaking directly to their needs that are not being not being met on the left, right? So he did a really good job of advocating for that. I think for myself, I think with meta-ideological politics, basically the idea is to shift from looking at specific issues to looking at the frames that we use, the ideological frames, the analytic frames, that kind of constrain or structure our political perceptions and political sense making, that also inform prescriptively the policies that we're for, that we think will make society better, right? And so I look at a lot of these different frameworks, and I'm really grateful to have met you and been interacting with you, Eric, and you introducing me to the whole gamut of the new right, of the kind of Catholic theological post-liberal school, right, with Ramil and Amari and Patrick Deneen and R.R. Reno. And I've read all of these books and have been metabolizing their insights and perspectives. And I probably literally disagree with almost everything they say, but thematically and abstractly, I see a lot of value in what they're saying. And it's given me an understanding of kind of the rise of the new right and what that kind of reactionary backlash is against, right? So I understand the critique, I understand the affirmative vision that they're promoting in their works. And basically the idea for me is to go out to embrace the insights non-exclusively of the entire political spectrum. And my colleague Nate Kaufman, who's a Republican conservative, he calls this Chad centrism instead of virgin centrism, right? So on cool. on the political spectrum, right, the virgin centrist, so to speak, occupies a center point at the exclusion of what it sees as the extremes. So the virgin centrist says, I'm a moderate, kind of a centrist in the middle, and I'm not going to embrace anything else except for my little slice of the spectrum. The Chad centrist says, I can embrace the entire spectrum all at once in a really large kind of mandalic embrace and steel man all of the perspectives and get some value or signal or insight from them. And if nothing else, get a better understanding of why people are drawn to those ideas. And then more power to you, right? You can talk to people from all over, right? You mentioned upaya, or the Buddhist word for skillful means, right? Skillful communications. You can build relationships with diverse ideological communities that are normally at each other's throats, right? You can translate your ideas and make more effective arguments by reframing the ideas and policies and values that you support in their language and on their own ideological terms. Right. So my biggest value is talking to people on their own terms. And in doing so, it shows a kind of respect and a kind of solidarity in that I can relate to you through the frameworks that are meaningful to you. I'm not going to try to impose my beliefs onto you and expect you to conform to them. Right. And over time, I think that will help to make society more coherent and less polarized and divisive. So meta-ideological politics, I framed it in the more normie language as a way of combating polarization. I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a map, like in the Wilberian sense of like a map. It's I call it non-systematized pluralistic pragmatism,
Gotcha.
right? And so I'd say it's more of an attitude or a disposition or a sensibility to non-exclusively embrace the insights from many ideologies and political schools of thought, to grok reality in its wholeness and complexity, to build relationships with diverging political tribes, and to revalorize civic engagement and basically give a tonic to civil society so that society doesn't just disintegrate with polarization and fragmentation.
No, I love it. No, for sure. Yeah. No, and I mean that's even something that I'm not seeing at times. Well, particularly, I mean, since we're circle back around to Michael, without Michael, and the I guess the space, and the discourse that he was bringing not only on the left, but how he was actually talking about the new right or postmodern conservatives, the way McManus is going out and framing it. Because to me, Matt and even Ben, I mean, they're very good, obviously, at identifying the threat. If you can go out and say it that, like, there is this holy crap. There's this thing out on the right. There is this new right. There is this Peterson phenomenon. There is the Patrick Deneen's of the world that are advocating this sort of, that are embracing, Christianity in a whole new way and bridging it into politics that is gaining force, right? So that the left needs to go and somehow address that and sharpen its tools and sharpen its discourse to go out and, take it on. And to me, I see it as a worthy challenge, right? All of a sudden, people that are on the left, obviously, I think should start to feel that, we have some sort of worthy opponent. And that to me is where I saw the sort of, shining light in Michael's eyes, is that, like he was like, oh, this is nice. Like finally I get to go out and really spar now with what's going on politically on the right, right? This is something that I've seen. This is something that I want to go out and wrestle with, and let's go out and duke this out. And Ben Burgess, to me, I mean, obviously he's very skillful and he's very knowledgeable, but he doesn't have that sort of integral background and that sort of philosophy or kind of cosmopolitan sort of orientation that Michael had. Mm-hmm. So without him there, I mean, one of the main reasons why I wanted to go out and launch this pod is to keep that conversation going, right? Because without the kind of integral component informing the left in a certain way and sort of massaging and starting to go and develop that sort of discourse, the way you guys, you and Jeremy, and you guys have been posting online in terms of the idea of the integral left, right? If there is this new left that is emerging, that is more integrally informed, right? That is adopting a sort of more meta-ideological sort of framework and is capable of going out and handling, all these various perspectives, then, we need to keep on pushing that and keep, advocating and obviously practicing that sort of discourse, not only within ourselves, but start to go out and bring it into the public sphere. And, that's why I was so happy that obviously Matt came on and that Ben came on and obviously you and now Jeremy, and so that we can go out and start to hash that out, because I feel that at times the history is somewhat being lost, right? I mean, there's so much there that happened between, the early 2000s all the way up till now that is going out and informing kind of what's going on politically, but also theoretically and philosophically, right? There's just so much going on right now. So that's one of the main reasons why I want to go and have you on and obviously hash this out. But I guess this is the other thing too, is like when you view the new right or postmodern conservatives today, do you think that the left is equipped to go out and deal with it right now, the way it's kind of organizing itself and it's sort of, positioned itself currently? Where do you think we are in this sort of fight or this sort of political discourse across, whether it be just at the postmodern level in terms of trying to go out and develop some sort of new discourse? Do you feel that the right is more powerful, has the upper hand, or is it currently the left? Like where do you kind of feel things are currently right now?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to consider, because I lead depolarization workshops and trainings, part of my job as a mediator and facilitator and what I do professionally. And one of my favorite questions I ask people is, like, who do you think has the power in society, right? And how do we tell, what is our method of gauging who has more power and in what ways? And I think the the left, right, it gets complicated because everyone has a different perspective of what's going on, right? So for the right, they think that basically all of society, or at least all of North America, is completely institutionally dominated and captured by the left, right? That kind of woke SJW DEI agenda has infiltrated and contaminated every institution, from education and academia, and even now with CRT in schools, to the media, obviously, right, to big tech, right? Like woke capitalism writ large is kind of like public enemy number one in the eyes of the new right. And so they see the left as having all of the power and kind of a monopoly on the narrative, right? Kind of a Gramsci-esque cultural hegemony critique. The left, I think the social justice left, still very much sees what they would call the right as being the dominant force, right? It's this neoliberal capitalist society with an inordinate amount of income, inequality in America, where the top 1% and the Bezoses and the Musks of the world really run everything through the power of global capital and private ownership and industry, and that the mainstream corporate media narrative is very much biased towards the dominant neoliberal regime. Government is absolutely, hijacked by lobbyists and private players who have rigged the game in their favor, right? This is kind of classic Bernie narrative, right? Corruption, money in politics, etc. And that mainstream, culturally, we definitely have very problematic cultural developments on the right, whether it be the Trumpism or QAnon or the Proud Boys or the alt-right, right, or the internet right, which I think the postmodern conservative movement is largely a product of the internet. It's a child of the internet, basically, right? That's what makes postmodern conservatism different from, let's say, traditional conservatism, right? The postmodern conservative gains its identity, its constellations of memes and tropes and values and identities in a kind of pastiche gestalt, right, from all of these internet sources, right, and are kind of born through these forums like Reddit and 4chan, and kind of coheres in a new way that makes it very distinct from traditional conservatives who gather their identity from traditions, from their local community, from grounded, embodied
Or
cultural
even just from
memetics.
the whole talk radio kind of
Oh,
days
right,
from the
right.
80s into the 90s, and obviously through the evangelical sort of airwaves and stuff like that. Yeah, no, they definitely,
Totally.
I mean, the online digital media ecosystem that the right has managed to go out and construct for itself is a pretty strong, no, totally. Yeah, no, I hear you on that. But no, keep going. It's a curious way that, because even the whole pastiche thing too, that's whole McManus's sort of framing and unpacking
Yes,
of things as well, right? And which is fantastic in terms of how he's
I love
gone
it.
out and diagnosed and written about that so clearly, that in terms of how postmodernism has gone out and not infected, but I mean informed, I guess, their way that they're operating now, even though it seems to be subconscious in a certain way. So that is pretty cool. Okay, but
Totally.
so do you think that well, I'll let you finish. I mean, do you think that they are winning in terms of how they managed to go out and build that, or do you think that the left has built a strong sort of ecosystem itself? Or what do you think of the left in terms of how it reacts to that currently?
Yeah, I guess it depends on definitions, right? So like do I don't consider like the Joe Biden administration to be like on the left,
Obviously,
right?
yeah.
I mean, like that's kind of a left perspective of like the Biden administration. A lot of people on the right absolutely think Biden administration is some kind of far left, like bordering on Stalinist kind of thing. Um, Whereas I think the left would be more like the Bernie Sanders AOC wing of the Democratic Party, right? So yeah, it's hard to know. Like, it's also an interesting question of how we measure like who's winning, or are we well equipped to deal with these new emergent ideas on the right, right? Like, is it like if Trump wins in 2024, that obviously that would mean like in some ways the new right, or the whole constellation of like right movements, traditional conservatism, neoliberalism, or populist, kind of the Steve Bannon, Breitbart kind of right wing angle has won in terms of like who controls the White House and so forth, and who has the bully pulpit of the presidency. But I do think that currently, I don't really think that the left is well equipped to deal with it, because I still really believe that Michael was right, that the left emphasizes structural and systemic factors. And right now, with the rise of identity politics and social justice and so forth, right, that those kind of narratives can be very alienating to rural, white, male, Christian, conservative types, who have nowhere else to go except for to their new right. So I'm trying to build bridges and create a more nuanced conversation where everyone's identity and values and concerns can be integrated and taken into consideration, so no one feels alienated and then polarized into one camp, right? So I don't think the left is doing that very well at scale or very consciously. And without Michael being a champion for that kind of approach on the left, I am very concerned about the ability to really talk to the postmodern conservatives and to militate against really toxic, really destructive, authoritarian, even fascistic developments on the right. So
Yeah.
I think we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. And because, there is definitely an online left that is present, right? That is much more online now than it's ever been. Like when I think about like kind of institutionally, I mean, Jacobin was never there till 2010, right? There is this whole sort of podcast ecosystem or the online left. And even Burgess kind of talked about that. And even Matt to a certain extent, right? Is that, like, well, if it is just online, an online left, right? And it is just sort of a sort of pastiche of podcasts and, talking heads online. Like, how does that go out and translate on the ground? But I think that's kind of funny is that, like every time I'm talking to people on the left, well, they're all professors, right? They're all professors in universities, and the other professors, that are in universities, they go out and self-identify as liberals or classic liberals, the Jonathan Haidt, Steve Pinkers of the world,
Right.
And we can go out and say that they're, well, I mean, I wouldn't go out and smear them completely to the right. To me, they're standard liberals in a certain way. That have they're very turned off the sort of, cancel culture and call out culture and that sort of whole sphere, right? But like, even for me to go out and sit Ben Burgess down with Jonathan Haidt, for example, who's had a big impact, in the sort of integral movement as a whole, right? I mean, Wilbur has gone out and pegged him as a sort of par excellence sort of individual, in terms of, in terms of psychology, but in terms of his overall, moral foundation theory is a real advancement in overall understanding of psychology, and even Peterson to a certain extent. I mean, I don't see Peterson as a very attractive alternative, and even then, I mean, like, how far to the right really is he, right? I mean, if we sit down with people from like obviously Rebel Wisdom and some of these other sort of IDW type communities that might be considered within this sort of integral sort of movement, but are not really to the complete left, kind of like Matt, Jeremy in a certain way. Like there is this fraction of the IDW that can go out and be framed as being on the left, right? But not, like as far as Michael would be, obviously. So the question to me is, how far, or can the liberals go out and be one within this sort of circle that Michael was going out and advocating for, right? Can it be flipped in that side? And I have a tough time, figuring that out as well. So I mean, that's kind of why I was curious to go out and kind of pick your brains about that. And this is the other thing too, is that when I was sitting down with Matt and with Ben, I pressed them about the idea of the religious left, because I feel that they leave the spiritual and the religious side out completely, where Michael was really willing to go out and embrace that, right? I mean, he was bringing Cornel West on. I mean, he was bringing on, he was talking about openly about his Buddhist practices, and he was obviously talking to people like Robert Wright, that, famously talks about Buddhism, and he was willing to go out and talk about Sam Harris as well, right? That Sam Harris is some sort of maybe closet Buddhist in a certain way. And that's being left out of the conversation now. So that's kind of, I guess, my pitch. I want to go out and have you on to talk about, because the right is co-opting the idea of what religion is, right? Although they're talking much more around Christianity in a certain way, What role do you think the religious left, or even so-called spiritual but not religious aspect of this sort of ecosystem and sort of dimension or phenomenon that we're talking about can go and have an impact on the political type stuff? Like, where's your thinking on that currently? Has it shifted over the last little while?
Yeah, it's another excellent question. So, in my opinion, someone who grew up in a Buddhist temple, I can say that I think it's very important, right? Because I think there's a kind of existential void that people feel, and they feel alienated and disenchanted, and there's a meaning crisis, right? And I think religion and spirituality, like, yeah, I agree with Michael that the right cannot have a monopoly on interior development and spiritual narratives, right? The left needs to provide that dimension as well as its kind of standard systemic structural socioeconomic analysis and emphasis, right? But I don't think that I like, for example, like Buddhism, integral theory, these are very particular forms of spirituality and very subtle phenomenological ways of interrogating your consciousness and deconstructing false notions of self to attain a more illuminated and diaphanous way of being. That's not appropriate for a lot of people, including, in my opinion, a lot of the guys being radicalized to the new right. And this is just coming from personal conversations with a lot of people who I've talked to who belong even more extremist circles on the new right. But all these young guys, right? I feel like what they need is even a little bit more basic than like Eastern philosophy, right? They're looking for like kind of a Joe Rogan motivational speech, self-empowerment. I want to feel more masculine and strong kind of a thing, right? It's a little bit more like base. And I don't really know what the left could do to speak to that. I think I really, this kind of like masculinity, femininity, toxic femininity, Me Too, woke kind of thing. It's really, really a core polarizing issue, right? Especially for working class guys. Because I go to the gym in where I live in Gresham, Oregon, and my gym is like super right wing, right? You pull into the parking lot, it's Trump, NRA, MAGA, Blue Lives Matter, up the yin yang. And all these working class guys I talk to in the sauna, a lot of them are actually pretty progressive in terms of economics and supporting higher minimum wage, and would probably vote for Bernie Sanders over anyone else, right? But they're so sick of the kind of woke culture and what they feel like is an attack on their masculinity, which is a really core value to a lot of these guys, right? Is masculinity, whatever that means to them, and they don't feel like that gets honored, and so they don't feel seen or respected as individuals or as men, right? And so there's a kind of a gender polarization dynamic that occurs, not even explicitly, like it's not even someone would have to go out and say like men suck and all masculinity is toxic masculinity, right? But even just the cultural ethos or aesthetic of the left feels like people's masculinity feels threatened, and there's kind of an allergic flare-up that occurs. And I've experienced this a lot in some of my workshops on DEI and so forth that I've led for conservative working class communities. So I feel like I've experienced it and can kind of emotionally grok their perspective and where they're coming from. So I think I always come back down to the same principles, which is talk to people on their own terms, translate it into a language and to values, and through an aesthetic through which they can understand and resonate with. And talk to them about things that are really meaningful to them in a way that's non-exclusive with left ideas, right? So we're not saying valorize masculinity and personal responsibility and personal empowerment over structural reforms, right? But how can both of those occur simultaneously and actually harmonize with each other to make both of them better, healthier, and just for society as a whole. So that's kind of how
and I think you're totally putting your finger on something. No, and it's beautifully said, because I mean that's, I guess, my interest as well, I guess, because of my background in religious studies. I've been fascinated with the whole kind of resurgence or revival of Stoicism.
Yes.
Right? Because Stoicism is a sort of, well, obviously it's a Western sort of philosophy, and it has deep roots within the sort of Western consciousness, but it's not, it's not Christianity, right? And Christianity's got a lot of baggage. Like, it's just got so much baggage, right? But if you are, if you self-identify kind of like much more from a Western philosophical sort of tradition and that you are a male, right? I mean, Stoicism could be a natural way for you to go out and build up your so-called idea of what, manhood is.
Oh,
And
totally.
for the strange thing is that, I mean, obviously I'm a bit older than you. Like for me in the 90s, Stoicism was not really there. I mean, it was this whole talk around positive psychology and transpersonal psychology and humanistic psychology. And not that, and even spirituality, right? I mean, you're spiritual, but not religious. As a dude, that's not something that, like I would go out and talk to my buddies that I played ball with, right? It's something that I went out and, read personally on my own, or it could be, I could go out and say, well, I'm talking about philosophy. But all of a sudden, when you start getting interested in terms of larger existential type questions, so that is a very difficult sort of conversation to go out and be had. And Buddhism filled that space for a lot of people, for me personally,
Mm.
right? That, that all of a sudden, my Christian heritage was just all messed up. It's just so much baggage there and it's toxic. And, uh, I'm not even sure Christianity for me personally can go out and be fixed, right. But obviously now, because of my background in religious studies and discovering the whole idea around modern Buddhism and guys like Evan Thompson, right, that are talking about cognitive science, and he's personally come out now and said that, like, oh, why I'm not a Buddhist, right, and he self-identifies purely as a cognitive scientist. And he's more of my generation. He's obviously older than I am, but I mean, I relate to his sort of dilemma there, in terms of figuring out, like, how does Eastern philosophy and religion actually go and fit into, to somebody like me who grew up Catholic, right?
Mhm.
Like, it's a huge question for me, to go out and try and make sense of that. But this is where Michael comes in again, right? Michael was talking about a very deep sort of rooted cosmopolitanism, right? And if you're taking a very cosmopolitan sort of worldview, then obviously there is this melting pot, right? But it's also this ongoing dialectical sort of of melding and transferring of knowledge that is crossing civilizations, is also crossing, religious traditions, and that they're transforming and they're always in the process of becoming. So somebody that's grounded in integral theory, to me, that's naturally so. Well, that's fantastic. But for a lot of people, particularly the new right, I'm seeing that exactly what you're saying, and that's my biggest question to them: is that, well, like, what happens to, religious diversity, right? What happens to pluralism, cultural pluralism within the context of the United States or even within North America? Like, how are you guys going to go and deal with that? And they seem to be doubling down more and more, like, right, close down the borders. So that part to me is just like unbelievably frightening, right? But I don't see the left kind of the way you've described it right now. Is that, like, what are they doing to go out and deal with that cultural, religious, and dimension that's being left out of the sort of secular, sort of socialist, leftist, purely economic dimensions to things that are going on. So, but what do you think of Stoicism? Where do you think that kind of fits into all this? Because, obviously there's the Stoa, there's Rebel Wisdom as well, that are out there now in terms of communities that have, started to go and advocate their own forms of discourse around the stuff that we're talking about. Where do you think Stoicism fits into all this, and if it at all, or have you thought about it?
I think Stoicism could play a huge role in helping the culture move towards a healthier understanding of masculinity and
Yeah.
personal development, especially for men. And obviously, there's been a huge online resurgence and interest in Stoicism, popularized for better or for worse by guys like Tim Ferriss, and it's kind of being
Yeah.
like appropriated into this kind of like, I don't know what you call it. I just call it like success culture,
Okay.
right? Like Jordan Peterson, 15 minutes motivational speech will blow your mind, right?
Yeah.
And it's like
Exactly. Yeah.
this really cheesy, like kind of like music playing in the background, and it's like the speech like a football coach would give or something at halftime to his team who's down by 28 points, right? So it's like there's a real need for this. There's a real hunger for people to want to feel inspired and galvanized towards empowering positive action and to make their lives better. And I think Stoicism can really kind of give the scaffolding to channel those energies in the most healthy and productive direction, right? Because what I like about Stoicism is it's not about trying to dominate or control other people, right? It's about trying to control yourself. So you take that what could be a fascistic impulse and you turn it inwardly, and say, how can I, through my Stoic practice, right? The Stoics make a distinction between invulnerability and invincibility, right? The goal is not to become invulnerable, because you're going to feel things, you're going to go through hard times, right? You're going to endure difficulties in life, like what the Buddha said, but you can become invincible to them, right? You can bear them with a kind of Stoic grit and persevere with equanimity and tranquility, and and confront these challenges head on. You can confront yourself and your own shadow, and cultivate this kind of strong, virtuous sensibility over time. And that, I think, gives a template for people to live a meaningful life in which they can really challenge themselves. This is another thing that Peterson really talks about. It's like really challenge yourself, work hard at one thing, clean your room, challenge yourself, become comfortable with discomfort, push your boundaries. And that's the only way you're going to find meaning and grow as a person, right? Don't become seduced by this lifestyle of complacency, and kind of like mythologically, it's like the land of the lotus eaters, right, where you're trapped in this kind of Peter Pan stunted development where you can never become a man, right?
Yeah.
And so I have friends who have suffered from depression and low self-esteem and the whole cornucopia of modern psychopathologies that any young man would face. And Stoicism and Jordan Peterson and kind of a combination of these things, right, really gave them meaning and a path forward.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think Stoicism has a lot of potential as a kind of philosophy to help with this. I'm wary of how it's appropriated in different contexts and by different people and to different aims, right? Like there's hustle culture Stoicism, which is basically can become very much a kind of neoliberal capitalist appropriation of Stoic values in service of industry and capital accumulation. I'm not for that, right? But I think that it can be done leveraged for good if we're conscious of how we're using it.
Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah, no, I see that as well. Well, I mean, that's been kind of the whole critique as well of positive psychology, right? That positive psychology goes out and enable neoliberalism, and the whole mindfulness critique as well, right?
Yes,
the whole mindfulness movement and that type of stuff.
Analogy.
So that's definitely an element that's there, and I mean, it can be, and that's the impression I get, or like when I hang out with guys like McManus or Ben. That are very much on the left, that are much more academically grounded in whatever, and they're taking much more of a Zizek sort of critique as well. Zizek has laid some pretty devastating critique against this sort of self-help, humanistic positive psychology, sort of pop psychology sort of framework that is infiltrated, neoliberalism to a certain extent, and is fueling the sort of corporate wellness world and stuff like that. So it is something to go out and be critiqued, or I mean, I'm very aware of that, but I'm not sure, and that's kind of the feel I get too about rebel wisdom in a certain way, and obviously the Stoa on a certain level, right? They're trying to go out and play that double-edged sword, right? And it's a difficult space to go out and be in, right? And you're right. I think Stoicism can go out and play a larger role because it's a philosophy, and if it is a philosophy, it can turn much more easily be converted into some sort of social movement. But any social movement can go out and be hijacked for good or for bad and stuff like that. So that's definitely an interesting thing, and that's why I really want to go out and talk to you, and obviously talk to Jeremy, because you guys are much more engrossed in that world, have been following that whole discourse much more closely than somebody like McManus or even like Ben, right? I mean, Ben is very much a socialist. He's, a true Bernie bro. And when I had him on the pod, that was really kind of my go-to, since he was picking on Hitch, right? And I wanted to go and get him to spill the beans about, what's his take on religion, and what does he think that the religious left can go out and be revived or be used for political means. And personally, I think it can, like my conversation with Jeremy was very much around that as well. Like, I feel like the religious left is an untapped sort of capital, to go and use a horrible word, but cultural sort of, legacy that's not being mined right now by a lot of leftists. And if
Absolutely.
anything, I would love to go out and play a role in that in terms of going out and mining that a bit further. Because I mean,
Same.
obviously Dorothy Day,
Hmm.
Cornel West, the
Hmm.
whole kind of Catholic worker movement as well, which I know
Simone
you've been
Weil.
personally,
Yep.
impacted by and stuff like that, can go out and have a huge role to go out and play in all of this. And also the engaged Buddhist movement as well, right? I find a lot of the critique right now against Buddhism is very superficial. I mean, there's could be obviously we can go and critique modern Buddhism,
Hmm.
to death and beat it to
Yep.
death. But there is an element there that's been doing unbelievable important work, particularly around the environment, um, that is not being properly, I think, channeled right now in this kind of ongoing mudslinging, political mudslinging that we're in. So yeah, no, that's interesting too. That I want to go out and pick your brain about that. And but how do you go out and wrestle? Because obviously you grew up in Hawaii, you grew up within a Buddhist family, and you're very interested in Christianity. How do you, in your own kind of personal identity and making sense of your own kind of religious worldview and stuff like that, how do you, how does that make sense to you, I guess, in terms of your Buddhist sort of, roots and now living in the West and being deeply influenced by some aspects of Western sort of thought, particularly Christianity and Western philosophy in a way? And where does that kind of fit with you personally in terms of your own personal identity now within all this fucking crazy sort of culture war that we're in?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I do is I talk to you. Uh, um, no, it's a great question. Actually, what's interesting is that my dad actually has two graduate degrees in biblical studies and theology.
Okay.
So he knows a lot about Christianity and was a New Testament scholar and knows a lot about religion in general, and kind of identifies as an existentialist also, and is a big fan of Kierkegaard's Christian existentialism. And so I've always had kind of that angle to buttress or supplement my Buddhist leanings. And my hero theologically is Paul Tillich and the Dynamics of Faith and the
Okay.
Courage to
Gotcha.
Be. Right? He's my guy, and I find a lot of those ideas very consonant with Buddhism. Also, Simone Weil's work,
Yeah.
and in her book called I'm blanking on the name of her famous book, but she talks about the void, and there are different Buddhist motifs that to me kind of crop up. But I think there are several things that I've learned over time to really appreciate about the Christian Western theological tradition that I didn't get from Eastern religion, right? So I think one thing is its emphasis on the transcendent, or God or divinity as being a transcendent entity or reality that's not immanently embodied, right? It's not immanent in the world, right? In the cycle of samsara, in the kind of ecologically interconnected material reality, right? It's something beyond. So it has a kind of Platonist element to it. And I think in my own spiritual life, like, when is that orientation actually more helpful than an immanent or immanentalist one, right? And I think in terms of my own spiritual life, I've realized that there are times that are so difficult that orienting myself towards a kind of transcendent force actually helps more, and than simply trying to work with something purely, let's say, phenomenologically, right? And it gives me the kind of, in kind of Tillich's language, the moral power of force and courage to surrender into the void, to surrender into the unknown. But sometimes it's only one's devotion to a higher thing like God that enables me to do that, right? It's my devotion to a higher thing, my love to a higher thing, that enables deeper phenomenological investigation into shunyata or anatta, right? No self and emptiness. So I feel like those are very consonant and synergistic. Another thing too, to me, I think, is there's the transcendent element. I think that's really helpful. I think the community element is also really important, right? That's of course a big part of Buddhism. Obviously there's a sangha, but I think the role that the church or the parish plays, and the role of how the community really helps you, right? And it's one of the beauties of religion that you can't get from like new age spirituality or retreats or yoga, right? Where the community is really in it together, and there's a very tightly knit sense of solidarity and support network that's engendered from that kind of community. I think the emphasis too on like virtue and character and morality, I think obviously the conversation around virtue and morality can take a very Procrustean, antiquated, pre-modern form. But it can that can be kind of bigoted, right? But it can also be deeply meaningful, right? To reflect on our values, to reflect on our character, to reflect on how virtue and character is cultivated. And this is, to me, one of the beauty of the axial age pre-modern traditions, is the emphasis on virtue and on character, and on the importance of moral restraint, right? The force that allows you to resist what Plato calls acrasia, right? Where you know you shouldn't do something, but you lack the moral courage or strength to do it. And so how do we galvanize that strength? How do we cultivate that strength within us morally, right? How do we cultivate our characters? What does it mean to live a virtuous life? What does it mean to be a good person, treat others well? I think these are questions that are really important, that really nourish people's souls, that we're not having on the left nearly enough, that other traditions don't quite emphasize, at least not with the same ethos, or not with the same aesthetic, right? Like there's all this talk nowadays of consciousness hacking, and I'm always like, well, what about character hacking, right? And my friend was like, well, that sounds boring, dude. Like, who wants to like develop our character? Like that sounds so like, old school, right? But I think there is something, the old school, that's really appealing to me. That's kind of where I'm most conservative. Is I really think, to me, character and becoming a person that's worthy of being respected is, to me, my highest value. And I find a lot of moral resonance with that in a lot of the Christian communities that I've interacted with, specifically in a Catholic worker group I interact with in Portland, who's really into Dorothy Day and Simone Weil and their Catholic worker vision, which is quite an eclectic hodgepodge of different political ideologies, right? There's even a kind of Marxist angle, right, emphasizing economic cooperatives and anti-capitalism, but also it contains a lot of religious traditional conservatism in it too. And I think the kind of integration of the unique blend of those otherwise ideologically dichotomous memes is really unique and actually really refreshing. So that's what kind of drives my interaction with these groups and my continual learning with them.
Gotcha. No, but would you say they're all to the right, or could you go out and say some of them are actually to the left religiously, or how would you?
So, well, it's hard to say though. It's like if you voted for Bernie Sanders, but you were still pro-life, what does that make you, right? Like, there's a lot of that kind of stuff, which I find to be really interesting to kind of juggle with.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's the interesting moment that I find ourselves in, right? It's this political realignment, and its impact also not only on culture but also on religion. To me, is such a fascinating topic, right? And because I mean, obviously, I mean, like I'm very like my first, politically, I'm not as astute as Ben Burgess or Matt, in terms of their whole understanding of the whole sort of political canon that they go out and draw upon, right? I mean, my background is much more in religious studies, but every time I see or I listen to them, I just feel that there's something going on on the cultural side and on the religious dimension that they're completely going out and leaving out. That Michael was just he had such an ability to go out and hone in on that so subtly, and yet with humor and wit, and present it in such an amazing way. Like the more I go through some of his stuff, I'm just always just so blown away about his work and what he's been able, obviously, to go out and accomplish at such a young age. So, I mean, that's why I used him as a sort of launching pad to go out and, for the my pod in terms of integral facticity, and to start talking about some of that stuff. So, like I'm so grateful for, obviously, like the conversations I've had now with you and with Jeremy online, and one, to get me to go out and reflect back on this, but also to go out and have an opportunity to go out and talk about it and share about it, because I think that's so important. I mean, it needs to be discussed out in the open, and it needs to be fleshed out in terms of, really what's going on there. on so many levels. So, like I'm so thankful for our conversations so far. And obviously I want to go and have you back on and go and explore some of these topics in more depth, particularly, I guess, the some of your roots. I mean, because I didn't realize, how religiously, like the religious roots, I guess, of your kind of family background, kind of growing up. I mean, I had no idea that, your dad had that much, sort of a training and theological background. And obviously your mom, obviously, in terms of, running her own temple and stuff like that. That's much more religious than I've ever been exposed to, right? I mean, me, it was all about books. Like there was no church, there was no temple, although I did spend some time up at the Montreal Zen Center and I've gone on my own retreat type stuff, but I haven't really gone out and lived or walked that walk 100%. To me, it's been much more of an intellectual journey, but obviously I'd love to have you back on. So for us to go and explore some of that again. And, yeah, so I mean, that's it for today. I mean, obviously I'll reach out and we'll go and continue the conversation and, take it from there, man. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Eric. This is fantastic. It's always great talking to you. And yeah, we barely scratched the surface. So
no, exactly.
There's a lot more to unpack about all of these subjects. So I look forward to next time.
Exactly. Lovely. Cool.